They called him a legend of the frontier, but the day the Apache woman stepped off the stagecoach, Elias Mercer felt the lie inside Black Hollow begin to bleed. The afternoon sun lay flat and white across the street, turning the dust to pale fire. Leather creaked. A loose sign tapped against its chain. Somewhere behind him, a hammer rang from the carpenters raising a wooden platform for the town's celebration, and every sharp strike sounded to Elias like a nail going into an old coffin that had never stayed shut. For 30 years, this town had told the same story in the same voice. They said Elias Mercer helped save the Parker wagon train at Dry Creek. They said he stood firm when others ran. They said the Apache raiders came like wolves, and they said white men held the line. The children learned it in school. The pastor polished it on Sundays. The mayor planned to speak it again at dusk beneath a new banner that read, "Honor the Frontier." Elias had let them. That was the part that kept a man awake. Not the first lie, the silence after. He stood outside his saddle shop with his hands resting on the porch rail, hat low, jaw tight, watching the coach settle in front of the hotel. A woman stepped down in a dark blue shawl dusted by the road. She moved slowly, but not weakly. There was no fear in her face. No rush. Just a calm that belonged to hard country and long memory. Apache, Elias thought at once, and the old ache in his chest tightened like rope. She was near his own age, maybe a little younger, with dark hair braided close and eyes that did not wander the street like a stranger's. They searched. They knew. Then she turned her head, and the light struck something at her throat. Silver. Small. Worn smooth by years. Elias gripped the rail so hard his knuckles whitened. He had seen that necklace before. Not in town. Not in peace. In smoke. In rain. In a child's fist. The woman looked straight at him. Not past him. Not through him. At him. And that was when he understood she had not come to Black Hollow by accident. A pair of boys ran by carrying strips of bunting for the evening ceremony. A merchant laughed from across the street. Someone called for whiskey. The town moved on as if history were a tame thing, tied up in neat words and polished boots. But Elias could feel the boards under him give a little, as if even the building knew the ground was shifting. He had spent years making saddles, fixing stirrup straps, speaking little, asking less. Men respected silence in the West. They mistook it for strength. They never guessed it could also be guilt left out in the weather, so long it hardened into routine. The woman adjusted her shawl and walked toward the hotel, though she paused once in the middle of the street. Her fingers touched the silver pendant at her throat. A small motion, barely anything. Still, it struck Elias harder than a shouted threat. Because he remembered a little girl at Dry Creek with ash on her cheeks, and that same silver pendant tangled in her dress while the night burned around them. He remembered reaching for her. He remembered another hand reaching first. Brown-skinned, steady, gentle, human. He shut his eyes for one breath, but memory did not leave. It only sharpened. "Mr. Mercer," the mayor called from the platform frame, cheerful and proud. "Do not wander far. We will need our hero by sundown." Elias turned his head, but did not answer. Across the street, the Apache woman had stopped again. The hotel door stood open behind her, dark as a tunnel. Wind pushed a slow ribbon of dust between them. Then she spoke, not loudly, not cruelly, but with the quiet certainty of someone laying a card on a table that had been crooked too long. "You remember the creek," she said, and the whole bright afternoon seemed to dim around the edges. Elias did not move until the hotel door had closed behind her and the dust between them had settled back into the street like old talk sinking into old wood. Then he stepped off the porch and crossed Black Hollow with the careful gait of a man who already knew the next hour might cost him more than the last 30 years had. Inside the hotel lobby, the air smelled of lamp oil, dry pine, and coffee left too long on the stove. The woman stood by the window with her gloves folded in one hand. Up close, time showed itself in the fine lines beside her eyes, but so did endurance. She carried herself like someone who had walked through loss and did not bow to it anymore. Elias stopped a few feet away. "That necklace," he said. Her gaze held steady. "My mother gave it to a girl from the wagon train the night the wagons burned." He swallowed once. "That girl lived?" "She did." The answer came plain. No triumph in it. No bitterness dressed for display. Just truth, laid down like stone. Elias looked at the pendant again. A small silver bird, one wing bent. He remembered that wing. He remembered mud and rain. A screaming mule, a wheel sunk crooked, and that bird catching firelight as a child cried for her mother. He had remembered it for years without ever speaking of it. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ayanna Redbird." "You came a long way." So did the lie. Through the window, he could see men stringing bunting from one post to another, laughing as they worked. The mayor stood in the street rehearsing lines with the schoolteacher, broad hat tilted back, chest full of borrowed pride. Black Hollow loved its own story because it made clean edges where life had left none. Hero, savage, survivor, enemy. It was a tidy set of words for people who had not been there. Elias took off his hat and turned it slowly in his hands. "Why now?" Ayanna looked toward the stairs, then back to him. "Because the child my mother saved died this winter in Santa Fe. Before she died, she gave me the necklace and the name of this town. She told me one man here still remembered." Elias felt that land inside him shift again. What was her name? Clara Bennett. He closed his eyes. Clara, a little blonde girl with soot on her face and a cough that shook her whole body. He had not known she lived beyond that night. He had not known she carried memory all the way into old age. "She said you tried to help," Ayanna went on. "She said you were afraid and young and wrong, but not cruel." Elias let out a slow breath through his nose. Mercy hurt worse than blame when a man knew he had not earned it. "You should not have come here," he said. "I know. These people do not want the truth. Truth does not ask permission." Outside, a wagon rolled past, iron rim grinding against stone. In the silence that followed, the hotel clerk glanced up from his desk and then quickly down again, pretending not to hear. Everyone in small towns heard. They only chose later what to remember. Ayanna placed the gloves on the table beside her. "Tonight they will praise a story built on my mother's shame." "It was not just your mother," Elias said quietly. "No," she replied, and for the first time something colder entered her voice. "It was a people. That is how these things are done." He could not deny it. He had seen how fear turned into a story, and how a story, once useful, turned into a wall. He had hidden behind that wall. He had married, buried, worked, aged, and let others paint him noble, because tearing down the picture would have meant naming what truly happened at Dry Creek. "Do you want me to speak?" he asked. "I want you to stop standing guard over a grave that belongs to the truth." Before he could answer, the front door opened and a gust of hot wind swept in with a lanky boy carrying newspapers under one arm. "Extra sheets for the ceremony," the boy said to the clerk, then noticed Elias and Ayanna and paused. One paper slipped loose and fell near the stove. As Elias bent to pick it up, another folded item slid from the stack and struck the floor with a thicker sound than newsprint. A slim leather notebook, cracked with age. The boy blinked. "Found it in the church storehouse with old hymn books," he said. "Pastor said bring everything fit to burn or sort." Elias stared at the notebook without touching it. He knew that brown leather. Army issue. Quartermaster stock. Something from long before Black Hollow learned to call itself innocent. By the time Elias opened the leather notebook, the town bells were striking for slow notes, and the whole of Black Hollow seemed to lean toward evening as though waiting for a performance none of them yet understood. He and Ayanna sat at a small table in the hotel dining room while the clerk kept his distance, and the boy with the newspapers lingered by the doorway, pretending to straighten the stack of almanacs. Dust had settled in the cracks of the notebook's spine. The first pages listed flour rations, lamp oil, mule harness, and coffee by the pound. Army marks. Supply dates. A clerk's hand, neat and indifferent. Elias turned another page, and there it was. Dry Creek escort detail. He felt his throat go dry before he read a single full line. He had spent 3 decades outrunning memory, yet all it took was one page and one date to bring the whole country back. June 18th, 1871. Storm expected. Civilian train delayed. Local scouts absent. Temporary contact requested with Apache party for water passage. Ayanna watched him read, her face unreadable except for the way her fingers rested lightly over the silver bird at her throat. "There was an agreement," she said. Elias nodded once. "Looks that way. My mother told me there was." He read on. "Goods exchanged. Safe crossing to creek. No hostile sign." Then farther down, in different handwriting, darker and hurried, a final note cut across the page like a wound opened after the fact. Confusion at dusk. Civilian panic. Misfire from wagon guard. Fire spread from overturned lantern. Losses incurred. Native party dispersed under blame of attack. Elias stopped reading. The room had gone very still, as though even the flies at the window had paused. "Read it aloud," Iona said. He did, each word rougher than the last. The boy at the door stared openly now, freckles pale against sunburned skin. The clerk's mouth had fallen open. The notebook did not tell every detail, but it told enough. Enough to break the clean shape of the legend. Enough to show there had been no Apache raid in the story Black Hollow loved to repeat. There had been fear. A shot from the wrong hand. A lantern kicked over in panic. Families running in circles through rain and smoke. And afterward, something easier than grief. Someone to blame. Elias rested his hand on the page. "Captain Harlan," he murmured. This was his note. Iona's eyes narrowed. The man they named the square after. Elias gave a tired, humorless nod. Outside the dining room window stood the sign every child in town knew by heart. Harlan Square. Men had tipped their hats there. Women had spread picnic cloths there. School children had recited the tale of brave settlers there. All of it had grown from ink like this, and from silence like his. "There is more," the boy said unexpectedly. Elias looked up. "What?" The boy shifted, suddenly aware he had entered grown talk. "Storehouse had a loose crate with old church records. Reverend told me leave the papers, take the books. I only brought this because it looked important." Elias stood so quickly his chair scraped the floor. "Where is the crate now?" "Still at the church." He was already reaching for his hat when the mayor's voice drifted in from outside, booming and cheerful, announcing that the evening gathering would begin at sunset sharp. The sound made Elias feel older than his years. There had been a time when men like the mayor believed stories because stories comforted them. Then there came another time, worse, when they needed the stories because truth would accuse their fathers. Iona rose as well. "We go now," she said. Elias met her gaze. "If there are records, they may name the families. Then the families should know." He studied her for a moment. There was no vengeance in her expression, only resolve. It unsettled him because it left him nowhere to hide. Had she come seeking anger, he might have known what to do with it. But dignity had a way of stripping excuses bare. Together they stepped out into the late light. The town square glowed amber. Banners stirred. Children chased each other around stacked lumber meant for the platform. A half-finished statue base stood covered with canvas, waiting for the ceremony. Elias had once believed time would bury Dry Creek. Now he could see the opposite had happened. Time had carved the lie into something permanent. At the church steps, he paused and looked across the street to the square named for Captain Harlan. Iona stopped beside him. "You still have a choice," she said. "No," Elias answered, his voice low and certain at last. "I had a choice 30 years ago." Then he climbed the church steps and opened the door to whatever Black Hollow had hidden from itself. The church storehouse sat behind the sanctuary, low and dim and smelling of cedar, candle wax, and the dry sweetness of paper left untouched too long. Elias pushed open the warped door and let the evening light spill across stacked hymnals, broken lanterns, folded quilts, and crates stamped with freight marks older than most living men in Black Hollow. Dust rose in slow, shining threads. Iona entered behind him, silent except for the soft brush of her skirt against the floorboards. The freckled boy followed as far as the threshold and stopped there, breathing as if he knew he had crossed into a place where stories changed shape. In the far corner stood the loose crate he had mentioned, one side split, its nails red with age. Elias knelt with a groan in his knees and pulled back a bundle of old church notices tied with faded blue ribbon. Beneath them lay a ledger, several folded letters, and a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. He picked up the letters first. The paper was thin and brittle, the ink brown with time, but the names on the outside still showed clear enough. Reverend Amos Pike, Mrs. Eleanor Bennett, Captain Nathaniel Harlan. Elias felt his pulse hammer once, heavy and slow. "Bennett," Iona said quietly. "Clara's family." He unfolded the first letter with care. It was from Eleanor Bennett, written 2 months after Dry Creek. Her hand shook across the page, even in ink. She thanked Reverend Pike for his prayers. She wrote that her daughter still woke screaming at the smell of rain. She wrote that Clara kept speaking of an Indian woman who wrapped her in a blanket and carried her beyond the flames, but that Captain Harlan had urged the family not to repeat such confusion in public because it would dishonor the dead and weaken the town's need for unity. Elias read the last line twice before he could trust it. Ayanna did not speak. She did not need to. The lie had just named its purpose. Not memory. Not truth. Use. He opened the next letter. Reverend Pike to Captain Harlan. Private and confidential. The pastor wrote that certain testimonies among the survivors did not agree with the public account, but that he understood the necessity of preserving order among frightened settlers. He prayed God would forgive the adjustments made in the interest of peace. Elias let the page lower in his hands. Adjustments, he said, and the word came out like sand. Ayanna looked at him with that same unbearable steadiness. That is what men call it when the truth belongs to someone they do not value. Somewhere in the church proper, a door opened and shut, followed by distant footsteps. Sunset was getting closer. The square would be filling. Elias opened the oilcloth parcel last. Inside lay a child's blanket, smoke-stained at one corner, and a small brass badge from the escort detail. He stared at the badge until the edges blurred. He had been wearing that badge at Dry Creek. He remembered losing it in the mud while dragging crates away from a wagon wheel. He remembered a woman's hand pushing the badge back toward him later through smoke and rain, not as a challenge, but as if returning something human to a man who had forgotten how to hold it. My mother kept that, Ayanna asked softly. Elias nodded. Looks like Reverend Pike kept it after. He turned the badge over. On the back, scratched by a knife point or nail, were 3 uneven initials. C.B. Clara Bennett. The child had handled it after all. Perhaps as proof to herself that what she remembered was real. Perhaps as a shield against adults who told her not to speak. The freckled boy stepped one pace farther into the room. Mr. Mercer, he said, voice small now, my father helped build the square. He says Captain Harlan made this town possible. Elias looked at the boy and saw the whole frontier in miniature. Inheritance, pride, and the quiet fear that truth might stain the hands of the living through the deeds of the dead. Maybe he did, Elias said, but not the way they told you. The church bell rang once outside, then again, calling the town to gather. Ayanna folded the blanket carefully and placed it back inside the oilcloth. This is enough, she said. Elias knew she was right. More proof would not make liars honest. This would have to do. He gathered the letters, the ledger, and the badge. The boy opened the door for them, and the last wide wash of evening light poured in red and gold across the floorboards. From the square came the murmur of a crowd settling into expectation. Elias rose slowly, papers in hand, feeling not brave, not redeemed, only finished with hiding. On the church steps, he could see the whole town now. Farmers in clean coats, wives in pressed cotton, children climbing fence rails for a better view. The mayor beside the covered statue base, smiling like a man about to bless his own reflection. Then the mayor saw Elias carrying the papers, and his smile faltered. It was a small thing, barely anything, but Elias noticed. Men who lived by a story could smell the truth before it reached the stage. Sunset laid a copper edge on every roof in Black Hollow, and the crowd in Harlan Square glowed warm and confident beneath it, the way people do when they believe the evening belongs to them. Chairs scraped. Boots thudded against the platform steps. A brass horn from the school band let out a thin, uncertain note before falling silent. Elias stood at the edge of the gathering with the ledger under one arm, the letters folded in his coat, and the old badge heavy in his palm. Beside him, Ayanna Redbird kept her chin level and her eyes forward. Some in the crowd stared openly now. Others only glanced and then looked away, as if refusing to place her fully inside the frame of the night might help the old story survive a little longer. The mayor spread his arms for quiet. Friends, neighbors, fellow keepers of frontier courage. He began, smiling toward the platform and the draped statue base. We gather to honor the founding spirit of this town and the brave men who stood at Dry Creek when the wilderness tested all that was decent and civilized. A murmur of approval moved through the square. Elias felt it like weather. Ayanna did not move. The mayor continued, voice swelling with each rehearsed phrase. He spoke of sacrifice. He spoke of white knuckles on rifle stocks and mothers shielding children and Captain Harlan holding the line. Then he turned with polished warmth toward Elias. And no name stands closer to that hard-won legacy than Elias Mercer, our own quiet witness, whose modesty has always matched his courage. A few people clapped. A child whistled once. The sound died quickly when Elias did not step up at once. He stayed where he was, looking over the faces before him. Men he had traded with for years. Women who had sent pies when his wife died. Boys he had taught to oil a saddle. He knew them. That was why this hurt. Lies told by strangers were one thing. Lies woven into supper tables and Sunday greetings were another. The mayor gave a small laugh to smooth the pause. Elias, come say a few words. Elias stepped forward at last, the boards of the platform creaking under his weight. He removed his hat, not out of ceremony, but because he wanted nothing between his face and what was about to happen. The mayor leaned close, smile fixed. Keep it brief and decent, he whispered. Elias looked at him, then out at the crowd, then down at the covered statue waiting to be unveiled. A hero cast in wood and paint before the truth had even been asked to testify. He reached into his coat and drew out the first letter. I cannot give you the words you came for, he said. His voice was not loud, but the square fell still around it. I should have spoken long ago, and because I did not, this town learned to honor the wrong things for 30 years. A rustle moved through the crowd. The mayor's face tightened. Elias opened the letter and read Eleanor Bennett's words into the falling light. He read of Clara waking at the smell of rain. He read of the Indian woman who carried her beyond the fire. He read the line about Captain Harlan asking the family to keep silent for the sake of unity. No one clapped now. No one coughed. Even the horses tied by the rail seemed to settle into the hush. When he finished, Elias unfolded Reverend Pike's letter next. The pastor, old and bent, sat in the second row with both hands on his cane. At the phrase "in the interest of peace," the old man lowered his head and did not raise it again. The mayor stepped toward Elias. This is not the time for confused records, he said sharply. These people came to honor our dead. Elias turned to face him fully. Then let them honor them honestly. He lifted the quartermaster ledger high enough for the front rows to see. There was no Apache attack at Dry Creek. There was fear, a misfire from our side. A lantern kicked over in panic. And afterward, blame laid where it was easy. A woman near the front put her hand to her mouth. Somewhere in the back, a man muttered a denial that sounded thin even to himself. The mayor's color rose dark in his cheeks. You would take one damaged notebook and the word of a stranger over the memory of this town. Elias did not answer at once. Instead, he opened his hand and looked at the brass badge lying there. Then he turned and held it out toward Ayanna. She stepped forward into the full view of Black Hollow, the silver bird at her throat catching the last line of sun. Not a stranger, Elias said. A witness. Daughter of the woman who saved Clara Bennett while we were too frightened to know friend from enemy. The square did not erupt. It did something harder. It listened. After the silence took hold, it seemed to spread through Harlan Square like dusk itself, touching every face in a different way. Some looked stunned. Some looked ashamed. Some simply looked old, as though one honest sentence had added 10 years to what certainty used to hide. Elias remained on the platform with the badge in one hand and the ledger in the other, while Ayanna stood a few feet behind him, neither pleading nor accusing, only present in a place that had spent decades pretending she and her people belonged nowhere near its memory. That presence alone had more force than any shouting could have carried. The mayor recovered first, as men like him often did when the world refused to keep its shape. You are asking good people to cast aside the story their fathers lived by, he said, turning now toward the crowd rather than Elias. A frontier town cannot survive if every old wound is opened by doubt and grievance. His voice found strength as it went, because performance was easier than reflection. We honor what built us. We do not tear it down for the sake of sentiment. A few heads nodded from habit. A few men straightened, grateful for words that offered them shelter from what they had just heard. Elias knew that temptation well. He had lived inside it for half his life. He placed the ledger on the podium and spoke without hurry. Truth is not grievance. He looked across the front rows until his eyes settled on the old pastor. And a wound covered with a lie does not heal. It only hardens. Reverend Pike lifted his face then. The crowd turned toward him as one body. He was a frail man now, little more than bones, wool, and regret, but what remained of his voice still carried. He is right, the pastor said. The square seemed to lean closer. I told myself peace mattered more than accuracy. I told myself frightened families needed a single story to stand on. I told myself God would forgive what was altered because the town was new and fear was strong. His hands trembled on the cane. But fear is how injustice first learns its own name. The words landed heavier than any accusation Elias could have made. The mayor opened his mouth, then shut it. There was no use fighting a confession spoken by the man who had once blessed the myth. Ayanna stepped forward just enough for the crowd to see her clearly. "My mother did not come to your creek as an enemy," she said. Her voice stayed level, and because of that, every ear in the square strained to catch it. She came because there had been an agreement for safe water passage. She brought blankets, herbs. She came with others who thought children should not thirst because grown men feared each other. A woman in the second row lowered her eyes. Ayanna went on. "When the firing started, your people ran from shadows. A lantern fell, wagons burned, and while your men shouted blame into the rain, my mother carried a little girl away from the flames and placed her where the smoke could not take her." Elias heard Clara Bennett in those words. He heard rain against canvas. He heard the confused cries of mules. He heard his own younger breath, quick and foolish with panic. A rancher near the back called out, not angry, but bewildered. "If that is true, why did nobody say it plain?" Elias answered before Ayanna could. "Because the dead were easier to honor than the living truth. Because a town in pain wanted a villain more than a mirror. Because men like me let silence do the dirty work." That was the closest he had ever come to naming himself in public, and once spoken, it felt less like relief than rightful weight. The schoolteacher, a widow named Mrs. Vale, rose from her chair in the front row. "Then our children have been taught wrong," she said softly. "Yes," Elias replied. She stood very still for a moment, absorbing the damage in practical terms, the way teachers do when they see how one mistake, repeated long enough, becomes a whole lesson plan for the future. Then she turned to the gathered families. "They can be taught again." It was a small sentence, yet it moved something in the square. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something quieter. Possibility. The mayor saw it too, and it frightened him. He put both hands on the podium. "This town needs pride," he insisted. Not humiliation, but his voice had lost its broad polished ring. It sounded smaller now, a man defending furniture while the house itself shifted. Elias looked out across Black Hollow, at the unfinished statue base draped in canvas, at the sign for Harlan Square, at the faces of neighbors trying to decide whether decency required stubbornness or surrender. Then he slipped the brass badge into his coat pocket and said, "Pride built on a false grave is only another kind of cowardice." No one answered him. No one had to. The evening air itself felt changed, as if the town had taken its first breath without the lie and found the effort both painful and clean. The square began to stir in uncertain currents after that, not with outrage, but with the awkward movement of people who no longer knew where to place their hands, their eyes, or their inheritance. Mothers drew children a little closer, not from fear of Ayanna, but from the strange instinct to protect the young when adults realize they have been careless with truth. Men who had cheered the loudest at ceremonies in years past now studied the ground or the brims of their hats. Elias watched it all from the platform and understood that this was the frontier too, though no song would ever celebrate it. The moment after a public lie loses its power and everyone must decide what kind of person they are without it. The mayor stepped back from the podium, jaw working, his confidence gone stiff around the edges. He looked toward the draped statue as though it might rescue him by remaining solid and unfinished. "Even if Captain Harlan shaped the account," he said at last, quieter now, "the town still endured. Families still buried their dead. Homes were still built here." Ayanna turned her gaze on him, and it was not anger in her eyes that made him falter. It was measure. "Enduring is not the same as being right," she said. The old pastor gave a tired nod. Mrs. Vale remained standing, one hand on the back of her chair, looking not at the platform but at the children clustered together near the bandstand. Elias knew what she saw. Not scandal. Curriculum. The next generation waiting to be told which version of courage would be theirs. Then from the left side of the crowd came a trembling voice. I knew Clara Bennett. Heads turned. An elderly woman in a faded plum dress rose slowly from the second to last row. She leaned on her daughter's arm and looked toward Ayanna with eyes clouded by age but sharpened by recognition of something long buried. "She boarded with us in Santa Fe 2 winters after her husband died," the woman said. She never liked the smell of wet ash. She used to touch her throat when storms rolled in. One evening she told me the kindest face she remembered from childhood was not white. A ripple moved through the square, but it was different now, less defensive, more human. The woman continued, voice breaking once and then holding. I told her she must have been confused. She said no. She said children remember mercy more clearly than adults remember blame. Ayanna lowered her eyes for a moment, and Elias saw the first small fracture in her composure. Not weakness, but grief allowed 1 inch of air. That testimony did what documents could not. It gave the town a living bridge between its myth and its shame. The mayor seemed to sense the tide leaving him. He stepped down from the platform without another word. No one stopped him. No one followed. For the first time in years, Black Hollow did not move where authority pointed. It stayed with the harder thing. Elias turned toward the draped statue base. The canvas stirred in the evening breeze. He could imagine what had been planned beneath it. Captain Harlan carved upright, arm extended toward the imagined horizon, frontier virtue fixed in timber and paint. A monument to simplification. He reached for the rope at the side of the frame and paused. This was meant to honor a lie, he said to the town. I will not leave it standing long enough to become memory. He pulled. The canvas slid away in a single rough whisper and fell at the foot of the platform. There stood the unfinished figure of Harlan, face half carved, one shoulder still raw wood, one hand shaped into command. In the failing light, it looked less like a hero than a ghost caught before completion. Elias stepped down from the platform, crossed to the statue, and removed the brass badge from his pocket. For a long moment, he held it where everyone could see, the little piece of metal that had once signified duty and had afterward become a relic of silence. Then he bent and set it at the statue's wooden boots. Not thrown, not hidden, returned. That is where my part belongs, he said. The gesture broke something open in the square. Not noise. Tears. Mrs. Vale wiped one eye. The old pastor covered his face with one hand. The rancher who had asked why nobody spoke plain took off his hat and held it against his chest. Ayanna stood beside the platform now, looking not at the statue, but at Elias. There was no triumph in her expression, only a weary recognition, as if she had traveled all this distance not to win, but to witness whether one human being would finally choose decency over legend. Elias met her gaze and found, to his surprise, that the sharpest pain inside him was not guilt anymore. It was the thought of all the years this might have been said and was not. Above them, the first evening star had begun to show. Black Hollow saw it too, though no one pointed. The frontier had always been full of hard men and louder stories, but under that sky, with the false hero unfinished and the true witness still standing, the town looked smaller, soberer, and perhaps for the first time, more worthy of the land beneath it. Night came softly after the crowd began to thin, and Black Hollow did not leave the square the way it had arrived. People departed in twos and threes, not talking loudly, not trading easy judgments, but moving with the careful silence of those carrying something fragile inside themselves. A few stopped before Ayanna on their way home. None offered grand speeches. One woman simply touched her own heart and bowed her head. A ranch hand, no more than 20, murmured, "Ma'am," and took off his hat. Mrs. Vale asked if she might come by the hotel in the morning and write down everything Ayanna wished the schoolchildren to know. The old pastor, leaning hard on his cane, stood before her with tears still drying in the folds beside his nose. "I cannot return your mother her good name," he said, "but I can stop stealing it." Ayanna held his gaze and gave a single nod. In the West, some apologies were too late to heal, yet still necessary to speak aloud. Elias remained near the platform after most had gone, looking at the unfinished statue and the badge resting at its feet. The square smelled of cooling wood, trampled dust, and the faint waxy sweetness of lantern smoke. Somewhere down the street, a piano started up in the saloon, then stopped after only a few uncertain chords, as though even music understood the town was not in the mood for old performances. Ayanna approached him without sound. "You did what you came to do," Elias said, though he knew the sentence was not quite right. "No," she answered. "I came to see whether truth still had a place here." He let that settle. "And does it?" She looked around the square, to the platform, the church, the sign that still read Harlan Square under the dim lantern by the post. Tonight it entered, she said. Whether it stays depends on those who live with it tomorrow. Elias almost smiled, though the feeling never reached his mouth. That was the honest shape of things. One confession did not mend history. It only opened the gate. I should have spoken when I was young, he said, when it might have mattered sooner. Ayanna studied him with a quiet that did not excuse him, yet did not deny his effort either. Sooner would have been better, she said. But later is not nothing. They stood side by side then, both looking at the square. For a while neither said another word. Wind moved along the street and lifted the corner of the fallen canvas like a tired breath. At length Elias asked, "What was your mother like when there was no trouble near?" Ayanna's expression changed then, softened not into sentiment, but memory. She laughed with her whole shoulders, she said. She could braid hair while speaking to 3 children at once. She knew which roots cooled fever and which songs calmed frightened horses. She believed men become smaller when fear tells them who to hate. Elias listened as if hearing the outline of a life the town had stolen and reduced to a slur. She sounds like someone this place did not deserve. Most places do not deserve their best people, Ayanna replied, and this time the faintest shadow of a smile touched her mouth. It was not a light moment, only a human one, and Elias felt grateful for it in a way that surprised him. Down the street, the hotel lantern burned amber in the window. "Will you stay?" he asked. "One night. And then I go south. There are graves to visit, names to speak." He nodded. That, too, felt right. The truth did not belong only to Black Hollow. It had roots elsewhere, in families and memories far beyond the town line. Ayanna took one last look at the statue. What will become of that? Elias followed her gaze. By morning, I reckon folks will argue. And after the arguing, he bent, picked up the brass badge, and turned it over once in his palm. The metal caught a dull glint from the lantern light. After the arguing, he said, maybe they build something they can stand to tell their children about without lowering their voice. Ayanna looked at him then, measuring whether he meant it. Apparently, she found enough truth there to continue. Good. She drew her shawl closer against the cooling air. Because memory is a house. If you build it crooked, your grandchildren will still hear the boards complain. Elias watched her walk toward the hotel, steady as she had been when she first arrived, but now without the whole town pressing blindness against her path. At the door she paused and turned back once. He raised his hat, just slightly. Not as hero to witness, not as white man to Apache woman, as one aging soul to another who had survived the price of being honest in a world that preferred simpler shapes. Then she went inside, and Elias stood alone in the square, holding the little badge and listening to the night settle over a town that might finally learn to live without its favorite lie. Morning broke clear over Black Hollow, with a pale gold light stretching across the roofs and the smell of coffee, dust, and sun-warmed pine rising into the day as if the town had decided to begin again before it fully understood how. Elias was already in the square when the first wagon rolled past. He had not slept much. Men his age seldom did after truth. The unfinished statue stood where it had stood the night before, but now it looked smaller in daylight, less like a monument than a mistake left out in public. The sign for Harlan Square still hung above the post at the corner. Mrs. Vale arrived first, carrying a satchel of papers and ink. She nodded to Elias, then looked at the statue and said, "Children will ask about that by noon." Elias glanced at her. "What will you tell them?" She set the satchel down on a bench. That grown people sometimes build the wrong lesson before they know the full story, and that honest towns fix what they can. He gave a low breath that almost counted as approval. One by one others came. The rancher from the back row, the old pastor in a heavier coat against the morning chill, 2 merchants, the blacksmith. Then, to Elias's surprise, the mayor himself, tired-eyed and stripped of his speechmaker's shine. No one greeted him warmly, but no one drove him off either. Black Hollow had not become noble overnight. It had only become unable to pretend. Ayanna crossed the square from the hotel carrying the silver bird at her throat and a folded bundle in her arms. The town watched her, though differently now. Not as threat, not as spectacle, as someone whose presence required manners. She came to the bench and laid the bundle open. Inside was the smoke-marked child's blanket from the church parcel. Mrs. Vale touched the fabric with reverence. The old pastor removed his hat. "I thought the schoolhouse might keep it," Ayanna said. Not behind glass like some trophy. Somewhere children can ask why it matters. Mrs. Vale looked up. They will. The mayor cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him. He stood with both hands clasped before him, a man plainly and used to beginning without advantage. The sign will come down, he said, looking not at Iona, but at the square itself. And the statue will not be finished. He paused, then added, I was wrong to defend what I had not examined. It was not eloquent. Perhaps that was why it sounded true enough to survive the air. Elias watched Iona closely. She did not soften. She simply accepted the sentence as one accepts weather after drought, useful if it holds. What will replace it? The blacksmith asked. No one answered at once. Then Mrs. Vale turned to Iona. What name did your mother have? Najoni Redbird, Iona said. The syllables settled over the square with quiet dignity. The schoolteacher repeated them carefully so she would not lose a single sound. Then perhaps, she said, the children of this town should learn that name too. The old pastor nodded. The rancher took off his hat again. Even the mayor did not object. Elias looked from face to face and saw no miracle there, only effort. Yet effort was often the nearest thing justice had to a body in this world. Iona turned toward him. I leave within the hour, she said. He had known she would. Still, knowing a departure and seeing it arrive were never the same. Will you come back? He asked. She considered the question with the caution of someone long accustomed to promises made by people on the stronger side of history. If this place remembers rightly, perhaps. Elias nodded once. That was fair. More than fair. She extended her hand then. For a brief second he hesitated, not from doubt, but from the weight of all the years that lay between what had been done and what was finally being acknowledged. Then he took it. Her grip was firm, warm, and brief. No ceremony. No audience required. Around them, the town of Black Hollow began its first honest labor in a generation. Men fetched tools, not to raise a false hero, but to dismantle one. Mrs. Vale started notes for a new lesson. The old pastor sat on the bench beside the blanket, head bowed, perhaps in prayer, perhaps only in remembrance. The mayor lifted one end of the fallen canvas himself. And Elias Mercer, who had once let silence stand where courage should have been, watched an Apache woman walk toward the waiting road beneath a clear western sky. The silver bird at her throat flashed once in the sun, then was still. He stood bareheaded as she went, and though no gun had fired and no fist had been raised, something more difficult had happened in Black Hollow than any duel the old stories ever praised. The truth had arrived in plain clothes, spoken softly, and stayed. Years from then, children would ask why the square bore a different name and why a smoke-marked blanket rested in the schoolhouse. They would be told that the frontier was not won by the loudest men, nor redeemed by them. Either. It was made human, once, because one woman chose mercy in the rain and one man finally found the decency to stop lying about it. By late morning the platform in Black Hollow was half dismantled, and the sound of hammers no longer carried the boastful rhythm of celebration, but the plain, workmanlike beat of correction. Elias spent the first hour helping the blacksmith pry apart the frame around the unfinished statue, saying little, because there are days when words can only trail behind labor and hope to catch up. The wood gave reluctantly. Pegs had swollen in the grain overnight. Canvas ropes tangled around nails. Men wiped sweat from their foreheads though the day was still cool. Across the square, Mrs. Vale sat with 3 children beneath the schoolhouse awning and began, in a voice calm enough to settle birds, to tell them that history was not broken when truth entered it. It was repaired. Elias heard that line carry on the breeze and wished someone had spoken it to him when he was young. Iona had not yet left. Her horse stood saddled outside the hotel, but she remained near the schoolhouse bench where the smoke-marked blanket lay folded, answering Mrs. Vale's questions with the patience of someone who understood that memory, if it was going to survive, needed structure as well as feeling. She spoke of her mother's name. She spoke of the crossing agreement at Dry Creek. She spoke of the rain, the confusion, the child she carried clear of the fire. She did not dramatize any of it. She simply placed each fact where it belonged, and the lack of ornament made the truth stronger. Around noon, a wagon from the mill arrived to haul away the unfinished statue. The driver climbed down, took one look at the half-carved figure of Captain Harlan, and asked no questions. In small towns, when a thing has already been judged by daylight, Decent men do not demand speeches from it. Elias and the blacksmith loaded the figure together. The wooden face, only half-shaped, stared upward into the broad blue sky with one blank eye and one carved brow, as if even the monument itself had never been fully certain of what it was supposed to represent. The mayor signed the miller's receipt with a hand that shook once, then steadied. No one mocked him. Public humiliation might have pleased lesser people, but Black Hollow seemed too tired for that, and perhaps, after the night before, too honest to enjoy it. When the wagon rolled away, the square looked wider. Emptier too, but in the way a room feels after stale air has finally been let out. Ayanna stood beside Elias near the corner post where the Harlan Square sign still hung. The painter, a shy man named Tom Bell, waited on a ladder with a wrench in one hand, looking for the signal to take it down. "Do it," the mayor said at last. Tom removed the sign slowly, careful not to splinter the wood, as if even false names deserved to be handled without cruelty when they were being retired. He set it down face first against the church wall. Mrs. Vale looked over from the children and asked, "What shall we call it now?" Nobody answered immediately. Naming was serious business on the frontier. It fixed value. It told future mouths what to repeat. Elias turned toward Ayanna. "Would your mother's name sit easy here?" She looked across the open square, at the church, the schoolhouse, the wagon ruts, the shops where people had once traded under a story built partly from her family's erasure. "It would not be for her alone," she said. "Then for what?" asked Mrs. Vale. Ayanna considered the children before replying. "For the crossing," she said. "For the moment before fear made enemies where there had been an agreement. Call it Crossing Square. Let people ask why." The schoolteacher smiled the way teachers do when they recognize a lesson that can carry farther than a date or a name. "Crossing Square," she repeated. The children repeated it after her. One of them, a little girl with sun-browned cheeks, asked, "Did your mother really save that child?" Ayanna bent to meet her eyes. "Yes," she said, "and many people could have chosen better that night. But one person choosing mercy can still change what comes after." Elias looked away then, not from discomfort, but because something in the simplicity of that answer struck too deep. He had spent years measuring guilt by its weight and public truth by its cost. Ayanna, with one plain sentence to a child, measured both instead by what they made possible next. By the time the town clock struck 1, the old sign was gone. The false hero was on the road to the mill, and a new name had already begun to settle over the square like light finding the land after fog. Elias stood in the middle of it, hat in hand, and felt the strange unease of a man who realizes redemption is not a moment of being forgiven. It is the quieter labor of living rightly after the lie is gone. The road south shimmered in the noon sun, and Ayanna was nearly ready to take it when a rider came in from the east at an angle that told every eye in town the news had not ridden with him gently. His horse was lathered at the neck. Dust clung to the man's coat in hard white streaks. He swung down near the feed store and called for water before he asked where he was, which was always a sign the miles behind him had carried urgency. Elias had been stacking and used platform boards beside the smithy. He straightened when he heard the rider say the word surveyors. In a frontier town, surveyors meant lines, claims, and the kind of trouble that wore polished boots instead of war paint. The rider, a clerk from the county seat, gulped half a dipper before speaking clearly. 3 men headed this way from Red Bluff, he said. Land office men. They carry papers on the creek route south of town. Heard talk they mean to close the common crossing and put a toll gate near the old water line. The blacksmith swore under his breath. Mrs. Vale stepped out from the shade. Even the mayor, who had not yet recovered his standing, seemed jarred into usefulness. Everyone in Black Hollow knew the creek route. Ranchers used it. Traders used it. Apache families had used versions of it long before any county clerk learned to square a boundary on a map. Ayanna, one hand on her saddle strap, looked toward Elias with a calm that seemed to say the frontier had not run out of tests, only changed costumes. "Whose waterline?" she asked. The clerk wiped his mouth. "They say a company bought rights through a railroad proxy. Wants to regulate passage, build a post, maybe sell access to stockmen." The word access moved through the gathered townspeople like a cold draft. In dry country, water was never just property. It was leverage. Elias thought of Dry Creek at once. And how many disasters in the West began when powerful men mistook a lifeline for an asset? The mayor frowned. That crossing has always been used freely. Paper says otherwise, the clerk replied, pulling a folded notice from his coat. And the men bringing it are not coming for argument. They mean to post it by sundown. Ayanna took the paper, scanned the seal, and handed it to Elias. He could read enough of the legal script to understand the danger. The company was using a patchwork claim from a former military corridor and an abandoned transport route to absorb the crossing into private control. Not guns, not raiders. Ledgers again, ink again, the same old hunger in a newer coat. The townspeople began to talk over each other. Ranchers worried aloud about cattle drives. The storekeeper muttered about freight prices. The blacksmith asked who had approved such a thing. Mrs. Vale said the children's families would suffer first if water tolls raised food costs. Through it all, Ayanna stood very still, watching not the panic, but the pattern. They want the crossing because it joins the creek, the wagon road, and the old Apache trail, she said. Take that point, and they make every traveler ask permission. Elias looked at her. You know the ground? My mother knew it. My grandfather too. The mayor, perhaps seeing at last how authority might be borrowed from humility as well as pride, turned to her without hesitation. Then tell us how to meet them. Ayanna glanced toward the road south, then back to the square that had only hours before begun to repair one old wrong. You do not meet men like that with shouting, she said. You meet them with witnesses, records, and everyone who depends on that water standing where they can be counted. Elias felt something sober and familiar rise inside him. Not fear exactly, but purpose stripped of vanity. This was the frontier as it truly survived. Not lone heroics, but communities deciding whether they would let greed rename what had always belonged to more than one hand. Then we go to the crossing, he said. The rancher nodded first, then the blacksmith, then Mrs. Vale. The mayor hesitated only a heartbeat before agreeing. The clerk from the county seat looked relieved to have arrived at a town that still knew how to become a town when pressed. Ayanna untied her horse but did not mount. Instead, she led it by the reins and said, Good, because if they post that paper before the people gather, the lie will begin early. Elias almost smiled at that, grim though the moment was. The West had changed its language, but not its temptations. An hour later, Black Hollow set out together under the hot bright sky toward the creek crossing south of town, carrying no banners, no rifles raised, only water rights records, church testimony, school ledgers, and the sudden understanding that the truest frontier courage might be the kind that knows how to stand in a line and refuse to step aside. The crossing lay 3 miles south of Black Hollow where the creek widened over a shelf of flat stone and cottonwoods leaned in from both banks, as though listening to every traveler who passed. By the time the townspeople arrived, the heat had settled into the pale earth and drawn the scent of mud, willow bark, and sunstruck water into the air. Elias had ridden beside Ayanna for most of the way in thoughtful silence, listening to wagon wheels behind them and to the murmur of neighbors who, 24 hours earlier, would never have imagined following an Apache woman to defend a shared rite of passage. Yet there they were, the schoolteacher in a borrowed hat, the blacksmith with rolled sleeves, the mayor carrying a ledger under one arm instead of a speech, the old pastor in the back of a buckboard, because even frailty had decided it wanted to witness what came next. They reached the crossing before the land office men, which gave Ayanna time to place people where they mattered. Do not cluster, she said. Spread along the bank. Let them see this is not one household, but all of us. Elias watched the townspeople obey her without resistance. Something had shifted cleanly overnight. Respect had replaced tolerance, and it showed in the way people listened before moving. Mrs. Vale gathered the children and women under the cottonwoods where there was shade and clear sight of the trail. Ranchers stood near the ford with their horses. The blacksmith and the miller unrolled maps on the hood of a wagon. The clerk from the county seat sorted notices, county plats, and old territorial markings, licking his thumb between pages. With the grim focus of a man who knew paper could either chain people or free them, depending on who read it first, Ayanna knelt by the water and touched the flat stones at the edge with her fingertips. Elias dismounted beside her. Looking for something? He asked. Proof, she said. She pointed to a line of worn grooves where wagon wheels had crossed the same angle for decades. A few feet away were older depressions, narrower and shallower, almost lost beneath time. Trail marks, she said, long before wagons. Elias crouched and studied them. The old route had not merely joined the settler road. It had preceded it. What the company called a transport corridor was, in truth, a shared passage layered over an older indigenous line. The county clerk hurried over when he saw them examining the ground. After a moment, his eyes widened. "If that predates the military map," he said, "then their filing is weaker than they claim. Public customary use. Possibly territorial easement. Possibly older." The words meant little to most folks nearby, but hope moved through them all the same. Ayanna rose. "Can you prove it?" The clerk hesitated. "With witnesses and visible use, perhaps." "You have both," Elias said, gesturing to the gathered town. Not long after, the land office men appeared as dark figures through the heat shimmer, riding in a neat line with a wagon behind them carrying posts, tools, and a painted board already lettered in black. Private water access. Toll required. The sight of it drew a low, angry breath from the ranchers, but no one moved out of place. Elias felt the old frontier instinct to step forward alone and settle matters by force, the kind of instinct legends were built from and graveyards too. He let it pass through him and die. This was not that story. The three men rode closer and slowed when they saw the crowd. Their leader wore city cloth despite the dust, with a watch chain bright against his vest and the stiff expression of a man accustomed to being obeyed by county offices and clerks who wanted promotion. He surveyed the gathered townspeople with thin displeasure. "This crossing is now under claim of the Basin and Rail Improvement Company," he announced, "by territorial transfer and legal purchase. We are here to post notice." No one answered at once. Then Ayanna stepped forward, not dramatically, but with the settled authority of someone who knew the land had a longer memory than any corporation. "You are standing on a shared crossing," she said, "used by local families, stockmen, freight drivers, and Apache travelers before your company learned its own name." The leader looked at her, then past her, seeking a white male official to speak over her with. He found instead the mayor, who moved to stand beside her. "She speaks with the town," the mayor said, "and the town is not yielding this route on a painted board and a borrowed seal." Something like irritation flashed across the official's face. "Sir, the law. Bring it down from the horse and let the clerk read every line aloud," said Mrs. Vale sharply from the shade, and the request carried the force of a classroom that had decided confusion would not be tolerated today. A few people laughed then, not from mockery, but from relief. The company men dismounted. Papers came out. So did the county plats. So did witness statements. What might once have become intimidation began, instead, to resemble a reckoning made of maps, memories, and stone worn honest by generations of crossing feet. The argument at the creek lasted most of the afternoon, but it never rose into chaos. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle the basin and rail men. They had arrived expecting to frighten scattered settlers, out-talk a few ranchers, and hammer their painted notice into the bank before supper. What they found instead was a whole community arranged like a living record. Every family, every wagon scar, every remembered use of the crossing stood there waiting to be counted. The county clerk read the company claim aloud first, his voice dry and formal in the heat. Then he read the weaker parts more slowly, because weakness in legal language often hides in words men assume nobody will examine. Temporary transfer. Subject to existing use. Dependent on clear military designation of route. Ayanna listened with her arms folded and the sun at her back, her shadow falling across the flat stones of the old trail. When the clerk finished, she nodded toward the ground. "And the military designation came after those marks," she said. "The blacksmith, the ranchers, 2 freight drivers, and the old pastor each gave testimony in turn." Mrs. Vale read from school enrollment records showing how often families from the southern ranches crossed there in every season. The miller produced delivery logs. A widow named Hannah Briggs, whose hands still shook when she spoke in public, described bringing her children through the ford during flood season because it was the only safe approach for miles. Then Ayanna gave the oldest account of all. She spoke of her mother and grandfather using that line to reach water in dry months before Black Hollow had more than 3 buildings and a church bell on a crate. She pointed out the older grooves in the stone. She named the creek in Apache. The words settled over the water like a reclaiming, and even Elias, who did not know the language, understood its power. The company's lead agent grew redder as the witnesses accumulated. Oral memory does not outweigh filed purchase, he snapped. Not by itself, said the county clerk, surprising everyone a little. But customary public use, overlapping territorial access, and predating trail evidence make your posting vulnerable to challenge. He adjusted his spectacles and looked directly at the man. And if you post now against active dispute, the county judge may enjoy asking why your company moved so fast on uncertain ground. That landed. The basin and rail men were not brave men, Elias realized. They were men who counted on nobody else being organized. The leader looked along the bank at the ranchers, the women, the schoolteacher, the children, the pastor, the mayor, and finally at Ayanna. For the first time his expression held not contempt, but calculation strained by the possibility of losing. You would drag this through the court, he asked. Elias answered before anyone else could. No, we would carry it there. Together. The statement traveled through the group like a current. The mayor stepped forward. And the town will sign, Mrs. Vale added. And I will write the record clean enough that even a judge with poor eyesight can follow it. A few smiles broke then, quick and dry. The company men glanced at each other. One muttered that Red Bluff had not mentioned local resistance. Another said the route was more trouble than projected revenue if litigation began. The leader took off his hat, wiped his brow, and looked again at the painted notice leaning uselessly against the wagon wheel. At last he said, "We will review the filing." It was not surrender in noble words. It was better. It was retreat dressed in paperwork. The townspeople held their ground until the men loaded the posts back into the wagon and turned the team north toward the main road instead of the crossing. Only when the dust of their departure thinned into the distance did Black Hollow allow itself to breathe out. No cheers rose. No hats flew. The victory was too practical for that. Ayanna walked to the edge of the ford and looked down at the water moving over the flat stones. Elias came to stand beside her. You knew this would work, he said. I knew greed prefers a weak door, she answered. Today it found one barred. He let the words sit. Beyond them, children had already begun skipping stones while their parents gathered maps and records. The mayor was thanking the clerk. Mrs. Vale was writing notes against the wagon hood. The old pastor sat under the cottonwood with his eyes closed, face turned toward the breeze, as if prayer and relief had briefly become the same thing. Ayanna touched the silver bird at her throat one final time. Now I go, she said. Elias nodded. He had no speech prepared. The frontier had too many speeches already. So he did the only honest thing left. He removed his hat and said, This town will remember the crossing. Ayanna looked at him, then at the water, then at the people who had chosen, in a single difficult day, not greatness, but decency. See that it remembers more than that, she said. Then she mounted, turned south beneath the wide western sky, and rode away along the very trail her people had known before maps, before claims, before men built monuments to their own confusion. Elias stood at the ford until she became a dark shape, then a smaller one, then only motion in the heat. Behind him the creek kept running, indifferent to pride, loyal only to gravity and time. And in that plain steady sound was the final lesson Black Hollow had earned. Out here, justice did not always arrive on horseback with noise. Sometimes it came as memory, spoken clearly, and stayed because enough people finally had the character to let it.